Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to MetrObelisk Radio. Today we are looking at the final Kelvin timeline Star Trek movie, Star Trek Beyond. Now, I brought up in my Star Trek Into Darkness retrospective that it was JJ's prerogative to change Star Trek the way he wanted, but how did that fare for him? How did Paramount do by giving JJ all of this control over this long-standing franchise? Was too much of the fan base burned by the previous entry? Now, before we get started, make sure to follow the blog, metrobeliskradio.blogspot.com. That way you can stay up to date on all Metrobelisk Radio uploads, no matter if I do platform exclusives on a platform that you are not watching this on currently. The link will be in the description below. So without further delay, let's tear right into Star Trek Beyond. Now let's start off with the creative team behind this movie. This movie was originally going to be written and directed by Roberto Orci, the self-proclaimed Star Trek fan that worked on the first two movies. However, when he turned in his script to Paramount in 2014, I think it was summer 2014, they told him to rewrite it because it was quote-unquote too Star Trek-y. And Roberto Orci and Paramount parted ways shortly after that. J.J. Abrams has a producing credit on this movie. It's most likely in name only. And Alex Kurtzman and Roberto Orci's names are not on this movie at all. So basically, in a nutshell, this movie has an all-new creative team. So let's start with the director. This movie was directed by Justin Lin. Now, most of you probably know him as the director of the Fast and the Furious movies, from Tokyo Drift up until Fast and Furious 6. The other movies that he's done that you may be familiar with are Better Luck Tomorrow and Annapolis, starring James Franco and Tyrese Gibson. Now let's move on to the writers. The first writer I want to talk about is Simon Pegg. Yes, the same guy who plays Scotty. Even though most people know him as an actor, he does have some writing credits to his name. He wrote a TV show called Space that lasted 14 episodes, but the vast majority of you probably know him because of Shaun of the Dead, Hot Fuzz, Paul, and The World's End, all of which he wrote and starred in. Now, it's definitely known that he's more known for comedy than drama. And the final writer on this movie is Doug Jung, which, his biggest writing credit before this movie was Dark Blue, the TV series that was on TNT for one season. He's credited as the creator of the show, and after this movie, he worked on the story for the Cloverfield Paradox. Now let's move on to the character analysis of this. So we have Chris Pine as Captain Kirk. Now in this movie, he isn't the bad boy who doesn't play by the rules like he was in the first two installments. He's more of a William Shatner Captain Kirk in this movie, and I honestly take that as a step forward. Then we have Zachary Quino as Spock. All of the problems with Spock, where he was just either really stoic or really angry, gets fixed up here. He doesn't lose his temper in this movie, so now the Zachary Quino Spock feels more like Leonard Nimoy Spock to a degree. Then we have Carl Urban as Dr. McCoy. He's still the same McCoy that was in the first two movies. There never was an issue with Carl Urban portraying McCoy, because McCoy was still written as if DeForest Kelley was portraying him. Then we have Zoe Saldana as Uhura. So here's the question on the table. How does a communication specialist have all of this knowledge and training in combat? Yes, she takes more of a combative role and not just phasers. I could believe that she would have training in phasers, that any position, no matter what, would have to receive phaser training at the Starfleet Academy. But in this movie, she's handling herself in hand-to-hand combat where we never saw that in the prior two movies. Also, her relationship with Spock is still present, but is only brought up maybe a couple of times, and it isn't too overbearing like it was in the first couple of installments. Then we have Simon Pegg as Scotty. Now, in this movie, he becomes more of a three-dimensional character instead of just being the chief engineer, and I believe that has to do a lot with Simon Pegg being one of the two writers on this movie. So, I think there was a bit of bias in the writing stage that was carried over into filming and post-production. In this movie, he's separated from Keenzer for the majority of the movie and finds Jayla. Then we have John Cho as Sulu. Now, he's relegated to the background except for one scene where they allude to the fact that he's gay. The scene is only 1 to 2 seconds long, so it could be argued that it didn't even need to be there because it was never expanded upon any further beyond that. Then we get to Anton Yelchin as Chekov. Now, his role was also diminished in this one. He goes back to bridge crew after moving to engineering in the prior installment, which was Star Trek Into Darkness. Now, this movie was filmed before his death, mind you, Anton Yelchin's death. So there really wasn't a need to diminish his role in this movie. Then we have the two new characters. So let's start off with Sofia Boutella as Jayla. Now, she had lived on the planet since she was a child. Krall killed her entire family, and she was repairing the USS Franklin to get off the planet and never come back. Now, she's shown to be a fighter, which is believable if she's been there since she was a kid and had to fend for herself. She can also set traps, which again, if she had to fend for herself, you got to learn how to do that. Otherwise, you'd probably die rather quickly. And finally, we have Idris Elba as Kral. Now, he's the main villain for this movie. Surprise, surprise. Now, what really didn't work about this character was he was too one-dimensional. His motivations were not revealed until there was 20 minutes left in the movie, and he died 10 minutes after that. Up until those last 20 minutes, he was just a guy who kidnapped all these starship crews to drain their energy to keep himself alive. Then he wanted to get a bioweapon to attack the Federation with. It isn't until the last 20 minutes that we learn he wants to attack the Federation because he was the captain of the USS Franklin and the Federation abandoned him 100 years prior. So he had to do what he did to stay alive, sure, and he had a disdain for the Federation after that. But when all of that is revealed, it was just too little too late to save this character. Now let's move on to the narrative analysis of this retrospective. Now there's two things that had to get worked into the narrative in this movie. The first being the 50th anniversary of Star Trek. This movie came out in 2016 and the first episode of Star Trek, the original series, premiered in 1966. So how did they accomplish this? By giving Kirk a quote-unquote birthday celebration. The second thing that this movie had to deal with was Leonard Nimoy's death. Now how did they handle this? They gave Zachary Quino's Spock a box of Ambassador Spock's personal belongings, and one of those is the picture of the original crew that was in Star Trek Generations, I believe. It may have been the picture from Star Trek 6. I don't remember. It was one of those two. Now, this movie opens with Kirk giving a piece of an ancient weapon to another race. Who or what the races aren't really important, just like in Star Trek Into Darkness, with the Enterprise crew saving the technologically inferior race from the volcano. Anyways, the race that Kirk presents the ancient weapon piece to doesn't receive it well and starts to attack him. Then we get to Yorktown, that's the Federation space station, that in my opinion has one of the worst designs and nothing is explained about it. McCoy put it best when he said it's basically a snow globe in outer space waiting to break. The actual architecture of the building does all of the loops, and it's not explained how people aren't falling off the various platforms depending on where they're standing. This isn't just some center of gravity like on Earth, where in the southern hemisphere people are being pulled up, and in the northern hemisphere people are being pulled down. The architecture of the buildings and roads can be best described as a long snake trapped inside a hamster's exercise ball. Yes, the movie is science fiction, but science fiction still needs to be believable to a degree. You know, I would have rather seen like a Deep Space Nine-esque style space station if you really wanted to have a Federation space station. And then, Kirk receives a mission to help an alien race that got trapped in the nebula just outside the space station. Basically, go in and get him out. Well, when they get to the planet, Kirk finds out that he's been hoodwinked and the Enterprise gets destroyed. The crew gets scattered and taken by this alien race that kamikazes themselves directly into the Enterprise. Part one of this narrative going forward is just find the crew and get off the planet. Part two is why does Kral want the artifact piece to this weapon? Now, one cool thing about this movie is we see an older Starfleet ship, which is the USS Franklin. In this movie, it was a ship that got lost 100 years prior before the formation of the Federation, and according to Scotty or Sulu, it was one of those two, it was the first ship to ever achieve a warp speed of 4. Now, once the Enterprise crew leaves the planet, the movie basically turns itself into what the first two movies became, and that's a bad guy with a big ship or badass weapon wants to use it to blow up a planet. In this movie's case, the bad guy wants to kill everyone on the space station with the bioweapon that he now possesses. Now, what would have made this movie better is if it had taken place on that one planet the entire time, like in Star Trek III: The Search for Spock, where Spock lands on the Genesis planet and Kirk's son is there to retrieve him. The Enterprise goes there and pretty much stays there the entire movie. I know that I slammed Star Trek Into Darkness for being too much like The Wrath of Khan, but this movie taking place on one planet for 85-90% of the movie would have helped the pacing, and it would have allowed the returning characters to develop more, and the new characters of Jayla and Kral get developed a lot better instead of the villain's motivations being revealed with 20 minutes left to go. This story was just badly written. Everything is just here to lead to the events of the last 20 minutes, and that's really it. Everything that happens on the one planet just feels rushed when it shouldn't have been rushed at all. All the creative team would have to do is cut down on the last action set piece to give more time to the one planet, and I think it would have worked out. Reveal Krall's motivations by the end of the second act, not when there's 15 to 20 minutes left to go. It tries to pull a quote-unquote twist, like Star Trek Into Darkness, by having this villain be who you're not expecting, and it just doesn't work because of the timing of that reveal. Now, what was this movie's reception like? This movie had a Rotten Tomatoes score of 86% based on 305 critic reviews, and an audience score of 80% based on 74,459 reviews. This movie has a Metacritic score of 68 based on 50 critic reviews and a user score of 6.7 out of 10 based on 892 ratings. And this movie sits on IMDb at 7.1 out of 10 based on 220,919 reviews. Sorry, I had a brain fart there for a second. This movie was made on a budget of $185 million back in 2016. So if we adjust that for inflation in 2020 numbers, that is a budget of $197,631,277.42. And it grossed $343,471,816 worldwide. Adjusted for inflation in 2020 numbers, that is a gross of $366,923,101.37. If you don't adjust the numbers for inflation, this movie grossed less than what Star Trek 09 did. Now, what was the drop-off between Star Trek Into Darkness and Star Trek Beyond? Adjusting Star Trek Into Darkness's gross for 2016 numbers, we get a 28.6% drop-off from the second movie to the third movie. Now, what's the drop-off between Star Trek 09 and Star Trek Beyond? If we adjust Star Trek 09's gross for 2016 numbers, we get a 20.3% drop-off. Now, if you remember from the Star Trek Into Darkness retrospective that we did, there was a gain between Star Trek 09 and Star Trek Into Darkness box office-wise. But here's my thing. It didn't matter what good this movie did for the franchise. And the movies and the worldwide gross shows it. And it did not matter that it was a return to form for Star Trek, that it wasn't like the J.J. Abrams movies where the characters are unrecognizable. The fans simply did not care. And in my opinion, that comes down to two things that occurred prior to this movie releasing. The first thing was Star Trek Into Darkness burning all the goodwill that Star Trek 2009 built. Hence why there's a game between Star Trek 09 and Star Trek Into Darkness. And number two, Paramount rolling out the Star Trek fan film guidelines, which I will go over in just a second. Now, before I go any further into this topic, I don't care what your opinion on Alec Peters is. You can either love the guy or hate him, but this is important to understand the potential damage done to Star Trek Beyond. Now, in order to understand the circumstances around these Star Trek fan film guidelines, you have to remember a little Star Trek fan film called Axanar. Alec Peters made Prelude to Axanar that gained a lot of views on YouTube back when it premiered in 2013, 2014. He launched a Kickstarter to get the movie made, and he crowdfunded over $1 million between Kickstarter and Indiegogo. And I think at that time it was the largest crowdfunded Star Trek fan film. Now, Paramount and CBS immediately filed a lawsuit against Alec Peters and Axanar in December of 2015 and issued out these fan film guidelines shortly after. Now, before I go into the negative, there are some reasonable guidelines that they posted, like the fan film has to be non-commercial, it has to have the tagline, a Star Trek fan production, and it cannot have official anywhere in the title. You also have to post a disclaimer that Star Trek is owned by CBS, Paramount, and you cannot imply any association or endorsement by CBS or Paramount. Those, in my opinion, were all reasonable guidelines. The guidelines that were problematic were that you could only make a 15-minute episode or a two-part episode, but that can't exceed 30 minutes long, and no sequels to that. You couldn't make your own uniforms or phasers, so essentially you had to play with their toys. Now, there are two clauses that pose big issues, and I'll start with the smaller one. That's number 9. Creators of fan productions must not seek to register their works nor any elements of their works under copyright or trademark law. Now, here's the issue with that. In today's world, you don't have to file for copyright to be enforced. This clause came across as if CBS/Paramount liked your idea, then they could use it themselves without having to pay you royalties or even credit you as a writer. It doesn't matter if that wasn't their intention. All that matters is the perception. And I personally would have loved to see them actually try to do that and have the fan actually take them to court. Now, the clause that posed the biggest issue was actually number 5, that it must be a quote-unquote real fan production. You couldn't have any professional credits to your name, and you couldn't use any of the actors associated with Star Trek ever. Sorry, CBS Paramount, but that clause violates labor laws all over the United States. And I will leave a link to the guidelines if you wish to read them for yourself. They're not long, and they're not too bogged down with legalese. Now, these guidelines only hurt CBS Paramount in the long run because it was viewed as CBS Paramount shutting down the competition. They simply didn't want to compete with the fan films any longer. You know, instead of offering to work with the people behind Axanar, or Star Trek Continues, or Star Trek New Voyages, they just wanted to shut them down and tell the fans to essentially piss off. Now, like I just said, all of the good that this movie did with the characters ultimately did not matter because of J.J. Abrams and CBS Paramount. CBS Paramount essentially killed their own cash cow by this point. And I'll end the episode off with this. The budgets on these Star Trek movies were also simply just getting too large to be sustainable. This movie had a budget of $185 million. Star Trek 09 had a budget of $150 million, and Star Trek Into Darkness had a budget of $190 million. The box office returns on each of those movies showed that Paramount barely made their money back on Star Trek 09 and Star Trek Into Darkness. Couple that with the Kelvin timeline merchandise not selling, and Paramount had a disaster on their hands before this movie even came out. The only merchandise I personally remember seeing for Star Trek Beyond was the Funko Pop line, and those went into the clearance bin quickly after that movie came out. Star Trek was never engineered to be a multi-billion-dollar movie franchise. It was engineered for the small screen, meaning television, and then it was brought over to the big screen later. Paramount wanted to have their Star Wars with these J.J. Trek movies, and we know that this just never happened. Remember, there was supposed to be a fourth movie in this series. That movie was being hyped before Star Trek Beyond even released to theaters. The fourth movie is now not going to happen because Captain Kirk himself, Chris Pine, essentially walked away from the entire thing because they wanted to give him a significant pay cut. He, Zach Quino, and Chris Hemsworth all signed on for number 4 before Star Trek Beyond came out, and after it bombed, Paramount wanted to slash the budget for number 4, so they had to renegotiate with Pine, Quino, and Hemsworth. Now, really to end this off, this series was never going to be JJ's billion-dollar franchise, no matter how much he wanted it to be, because Star Trek was a TV show first that became a film franchise, instead of a film franchise that got turned into a TV show.